The hidden years, uncovering the greatest gap in biblical history. What if everything you thought you knew about Jesus was incomplete? What if the most formative years of his life, the years that shaped him into the figure who would change the course of human history, were completely missing from the pages we call sacred? For those of us raised with traditional biblical teachings, the story of Jesus follows a familiar path. Born in Bethlehem, visited by wise men, escaping to Egypt as a baby. Then in the Gospel of Luke we catch a brief, tantalizing glimpse of Jesus at age 12, astounding the teachers in the Jerusalem temple with his wisdom and understanding. But then something extraordinary happens, or rather, fails to happen. The narrative goes completely silent. The next time we see Jesus in the biblical record, he's approximately 30 years old, stepping into the Jordan River to be baptized by John. 18 years. Gone. Vanished. The equivalent of his entire adolescence and young adulthood. Completely absent from Scripture. These are the most transformative years in any person's life, when character is formed, worldviews are shaped, and life paths are determined. Yet for the central figure of Christianity, this period remains shrouded in darkness. But what if I told you these lost years weren't actually lost at all? What if they had been preserved for centuries, protected by guardians of an ancient tradition in the highlands of Ethiopia, one of the oldest Christian nations on earth? My journey to uncover this hidden knowledge began 3 years ago, when rumors of ancient manuscripts describing Jesus' adolescence led me to the remote mountains of northern Ethiopia. After weeks of negotiations and proving my scholarly intentions, I found myself climbing a treacherous path carved into a sheer cliff face, the only route to the isolated monastery of Debre Damo, accessible only by climbing a leather rope tossed down by monks. "Few outsiders have seen what I'm about to show you," whispered Abba Gabriel, the elderly monk, who had reluctantly agreed to be my guide. His weathered hands, stained with decades of handling ancient parchment, trembled slightly as he unlocked a small wooden door sealed with beeswax. These texts have survived invasions, fires, and the modern world's indifference, but even greater threats now loom. As the door swung open, the scent of ancient leather and frankincense enveloped us. In the dim light of oil lamps, I beheld what few Western eyes have ever seen: leather-bound manuscripts dating back to the 4th century, written in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of Ethiopian Christianity. Among them was a text the monk called The Contentions of Christ, containing detailed accounts of Jesus' life between ages 12 and 30. The moment was overwhelming. Here, preserved for nearly 2 millennia, were answers to questions that biblical scholars had debated for centuries. Who was Jesus as a teenager? Where did he go? Who taught him? How did he come to understand his divine nature and purpose? "We are racing against time," Abba Gabriel explained gravely. "Modern science gives these manuscripts perhaps 50 more years before the parchment deteriorates beyond recovery. Climate change is bringing unprecedented humidity to our mountains. Political instability threatens our borders. And with each passing generation, fewer monks learn the ancient Ge'ez language needed to interpret these texts." As I carefully photographed each page with specialized equipment, Abba Gabriel revealed that many pages had already been lost to a fire in 1938. Dozens more were damaged during the Italian occupation of the 1930s, when soldiers looted the monastery's treasures. Even more disturbing, he confided that several uniquely valuable manuscripts had recently disappeared, suspected to have been stolen and sold on the black market. "What you're seeing is merely what remains," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of centuries. "The full story was once much richer." And so began my investigation into what might be the most significant untold chapter in the history of Christianity, the adolescence and early adulthood of its founder, preserved not in Rome or Jerusalem, but in the mountains of East Africa. What I discovered challenges not just what we know about Jesus, but why certain powerful interests throughout history didn't want you to know it. The questions haunted me. Why were these stories removed from our traditional Bible? Who made these decisions, and what were their true motives? And perhaps most importantly, what secrets about Jesus' formative years have been hiding in plain sight for nearly 2,000 years, waiting for the world to rediscover them? These questions would lead me on a journey through ancient manuscripts, forgotten histories, and modern scientific discoveries. A journey that reveals a Jesus far more complex and human than many of us have been taught to believe. The Ethiopian Bible, Africa's ancient Christian legacy. When most people think of Christianity's origins, they envision the Middle East and Europe. Yet hidden in plain sight stands one of the world's oldest Christian traditions, a living link to the earliest days of the faith. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church possesses what might be the most authentic collection of early Christian writings still in existence today. The Gaze Bible of Ethiopia contains 81 books, compared to the 66 in most Protestant Bibles, or 73 in Catholic versions. These additional texts aren't recent additions or later inventions. They represent traditions maintained continuously since Christianity's earliest centuries. Among these treasures are texts that detail Jesus' adolescence and young adulthood, writings deliberately excluded from Western biblical canons during the standardization process that began with the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. What makes our Bible extraordinary, explains Abba Tewodros, a senior scholar at Addis Ababa's Holy Trinity Theological College, is that our isolation preserved diversity. While Rome standardized and centralized, Ethiopia maintained the full spectrum of early Christian thought, including texts that didn't align with emerging political interests. Ethiopia's Christian heritage stands apart in critical ways. Unlike other African nations, Ethiopia received Christianity not from European missionaries, but directly from the Middle East in the 1st century. According to both Ethiopian tradition and Acts 8:26-40, Christianity arrived when the Ethiopian eunuch, a royal official serving Queen Candace, encountered Philip the Evangelist and brought the faith back to his homeland. This makes Ethiopia potentially one of the earliest Christian nations outside the Middle East, establishing its traditions before many European regions had even heard of Jesus. Even more remarkably, Ethiopia maintained this ancient tradition while successfully resisting European colonization. It stands as the only African nation to preserve its independence during the scramble for Africa, allowing its religious practices to develop without the same Western influences that shaped Christianity elsewhere on the continent. This historical independence created a unique theological time capsule, preserving voices and perspectives that were systematically silenced elsewhere. The physical manuscripts themselves are breathtaking artifacts. In a climate-controlled chamber beneath Addis Ababa's National Museum, I was permitted to examine the Garima Gospels, carbon-dated to between 330 to 650 AD and considered among the world's oldest complete illustrated Christian manuscripts. The pages, made from carefully prepared goatskin parchment, remain supple and intact after nearly 1,700 years. Each manuscript required the skins of up to 500 animals, explained the museum's conservation specialist, demonstrating the extraordinary investment these texts represented in ancient times. The red and black inks were created using formulas developed over centuries. Iron gall mixed with specific local plant extracts that resist fading even after millennia. The preservation methods are equally remarkable. Ancient Ethiopian scribes developed techniques unknown in Europe, including a special beeswax treatment for binding leather that created water-resistant covers. Each manuscript was wrapped in layers of silk and cotton before being stored in clay containers, sealed with mixtures of beeswax and aromatic resins that naturally repelled insects and prevented mold. Every manuscript has a dedicated guardian, whispered Abba Tewodros as we watched an elderly monk perform the daily ritual of manuscript care, unwrapping, inspecting, and carefully turning each page while reciting prayers believed to spiritually protect the texts. Some monk families have been custodians of specific texts for over 30 generations. Perhaps most intriguing are the encoding systems embedded within the texts themselves. Between lines of conventional Ge'ez script, specially trained Ethiopian scribes incorporated symbolic markings invisible to the untrained eye, a system of notation that conveys additional layers of meaning. According to Ethiopian tradition, these symbols represent an oral teaching tradition stretching back to the apostolic age. These are not mere books, Abba Tewodros emphasized, pointing to subtle patterns within the text margins. They are complex spiritual technologies for preserving knowledge across centuries. The true meaning emerges only when the written word intersects with the oral tradition, protected by our monks. The Ethiopian connection to biblical history runs even deeper. According to their ancient text called the Kebra Nagast, or Glory of Kings, the Queen of Sheba, known in Ethiopia as Queen Makeda, and King Solomon had a son named Menelik I, who became Ethiopia's first emperor. Ethiopian tradition holds that when Menelik visited his father in Jerusalem, he returned with the original Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest containing the Ten Commandments, which they believe remains in Aksum to this day, guarded by a single monk who never leaves the sanctuary. While Western scholars long dismissed this as legend, genetic research from the University of Cambridge in 2012 detected a significant genetic mixing between Ethiopian and Middle Eastern populations dating precisely to around 3,000 years ago, the exact period when Solomon would have reigned. This scientific evidence has forced scholars to reconsider Ethiopia's ancient claims with new seriousness. What emerges is a picture of an ancient Christian tradition that preserved what others lost. A living link to Christianity's earliest and most diverse expressions, maintaining texts and practices that powerful interests elsewhere systematically eliminated. In these Ethiopian manuscripts lies a different vision of Jesus and his teachings, one that challenges many of our modern assumptions about Christianity's founder and his message. The Forgotten Jesus. Revelations from the Missing Years. The Ethiopian texts offer a portrait of Jesus dramatically different from the one familiar to most Western Christians. A young Jesus who is still growing, learning, and mastering his extraordinary abilities. These accounts paint a more complex and human picture of Christianity's central figure during those crucial formative years between ages 12 and 30. One of the most striking accounts appears in the Ethiopian Book of the Contending of Christ, which describes a 13-year-old Jesus helping his father Joseph in the carpentry workshop. A wealthy merchant had commissioned an ornate wooden bed, but Joseph accidentally cut one of the support beams too short, a potentially devastating error for the struggling family business. "Do not worry, Father," the teenage Jesus reportedly said. "Let me fix this." According to the text, Jesus took hold of the beam and stretched it to the correct length, then turned to Joseph and said, "See how all things obey me. Yet I obey you, for this is what my Father in heaven has ordained." Dr. Esther McConnell, professor of ancient texts at Addis Ababa University, explains the significance. This story reveals a Jesus who already understood his divine nature, but was still learning the responsibility that came with it. This theme of power balanced with restraint runs throughout the Ethiopian accounts of his adolescence, a crucial developmental journey missing from Western Bibles. Another remarkable passage describes Jesus at age 15, forming birds from riverbank clay with other children on the Sabbath. When elders scolded them for this forbidden labor, Jesus reportedly clapped his hands and commanded the clay birds to come to life. They flew away, chirping, as astonished witnesses fell to their knees. This same story appears in the Infancy Gospel of Thomas and Arabic Infancy Gospel, suggesting it comes from an early widespread tradition about Jesus' youth. Not all stories portray a perfect young Messiah, however. One controversial account describes a 16-year-old Jesus becoming angry when another boy accidentally bumped into him, causing him to drop a water jar. "You shall not finish your journey," Jesus reportedly said, and the boy immediately fell ill. When villagers complained to Joseph about his son's harsh reaction, the text describes how Jesus allowed his father to take him by the ear as discipline. He then healed the boy, saying, "Let this teach us both, you to watch your path, and me to temper justice with mercy." These more troubling stories present a young Jesus still reconciling his human emotions with his divine nature, learning through trial and error the responsible use of extraordinary power. While critics point to these accounts as evidence of later fabrication, defenders argue they show something more profound: Jesus' authentic human development. These texts don't undermine Jesus' divinity, they deepen our understanding of his humanity, explains Father Gebre Mehil Wolde, who has protected these manuscripts for 43 years at the remote monastery of Debre Libanos. As he carefully turns pages of a 700-year-old copy of the original texts, his weathered fingers trace words that few outsiders have ever seen. "For my entire life I have risen at 3 a.m. to pray with these sacred writings," he says, his eyes reflecting the flickering lamplight. "When I read how young Jesus struggled with anger before mastering it, I feel closer to him. I see not just a God to worship, but a brother who understands our human journey." The Ethiopian texts also contain accounts of Jesus' extensive travels during these years, journeys completely absent from Western Bibles. One passage describes Jesus at age 20 traveling with merchants to India, where he studied with Hindu mystics in the Himalayas. Another recounts his sojourn in Egypt, learning from an aging priest of Isis who had converted to Judaism, synthesizing ancient wisdom with his emerging spiritual understanding. These travel narratives depict Jesus absorbing diverse philosophical traditions, explaining how the young carpenter from Nazareth later displayed such extraordinary wisdom and teaching skills. They suggest an intellectually curious young man actively seeking knowledge across the ancient world's spiritual traditions. Professor Elizabeth Johnson of Oxford University, a leading expert on early Christian texts, acknowledges the significance of these Ethiopian accounts. While we cannot verify these texts as historically accurate, they provide invaluable insight into how early Christian communities understood Jesus' development. The Ethiopian tradition preserved perspectives that were systematically eliminated elsewhere as the Church standardized its message under Roman influence. The Ethiopian manuscripts also offer surprising details about Jesus' relationships. Several passages describe his close friendship with Mary Magdalene from adolescence, suggesting she was his intellectual equal and spiritual confidant years before his public ministry began. Other accounts mention siblings and extended family members absent from canonical Gospels. These texts face significant scholarly challenges. Their age, transmission history, and relationship to other ancient writings remain subjects of intense debate. But scientific analysis of the oldest Ethiopian manuscripts confirms their antiquity, with parchment dating techniques placing some fragments as early as the 4th century, contemporary with the oldest known biblical manuscripts. The scholarly community is increasingly recognizing these texts not as late inventions, but as independent streams from Christianity's earliest days, explains Dr. Mekanen. They represent voices and perspectives that lost the political struggles of the 4th and 5th centuries, but never truly disappeared. The picture that emerges from these accounts is of a Jesus who wasn't born with complete understanding of his nature and purpose, but grew into it gradually. A divine being having an authentic human experience, complete with the struggles, doubts, and developmental challenges all humans face. This more complex Jesus, learning, growing, sometimes failing, and ultimately transcending human limitations, offers something profound that the perfect, fully formed Savior of Western tradition cannot: a model for authentic human development and the genuine challenge of mastering our own nature. The silenced scriptures, power, politics, and the making of the Bible. The question that haunts anyone encountering these Ethiopian texts is inevitable. Why were these accounts of Jesus' adolescence and early adulthood systematically excluded from Western biblical traditions? The answer reveals as much about the politics of early Christianity as it does about theology. In the centuries following Jesus' death, Christianity was far from unified. Multiple interpretations of Jesus' life and teachings circulated throughout the Mediterranean world, North Africa, and the Middle East. These diverse communities maintained their own collections of texts, oral traditions, and theological perspectives. Early Christianity was a vibrant tapestry of distinct voices rather than a monolithic institution. This changed dramatically in the 4th century, when Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity and sought to unify his empire under a standardized version of the faith. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD marked a pivotal moment, not just for establishing doctrinal positions, but for beginning the process of determining which texts would be considered authoritative and which would be marginalized. What most people don't realize is how political this process was, explains Dr. Robert Ferguson, historian of early Christianity at Princeton University. Constantine didn't convene the Council of Nicaea primarily out of theological concern, but as a political strategy to unify his fragmented empire. Religious standardization served imperial interests. The subsequent councils and synods further refined this canonical process, culminating in Athanasius of Alexandria's famous Easter letter of 367 AD, which first listed the 27 books of the New Testament as we know them today. But these decisions weren't made in a political vacuum. They reflected specific theological positions that had gained institutional power. One striking pattern emerges when examining which texts were excluded. Writings that emphasized Jesus' humanity often lost out to those emphasizing his divinity. The Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD established the doctrine that Jesus was fully human and fully divine. But in practice, many texts highlighting his human development were systematically marginalized. This created a fundamental tension. Official doctrine acknowledged Jesus' humanity, but the authorized texts minimized his human development. The Ethiopian texts, with their stories of Jesus learning, growing, and sometimes struggling with his powers, didn't fit this emerging narrative. There's a stark contrast between Western and Eastern approaches to these texts, notes Dr. Eleni Zaude, expert in comparative religious traditions at the University of Addis Ababa. Western traditions, heavily influenced by Roman legal and philosophical frameworks, prioritized doctrinal precision and institutional hierarchy. Eastern traditions, including Ethiopia's, preserved a more holistic approach that embraced paradox and developmental narratives. This divergence created two fundamentally different Christian worldviews. Western Christianity, centered in Rome, developed highly centralized authority structures and standardized texts. Eastern traditions, including those in Ethiopia, Armenia, Syria, and Egypt, maintained more diverse collections of writings and more decentralized authority structures. The geopolitical dimension cannot be overlooked. As Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, theological positions that supported imperial power gained institutional backing. Texts that might inspire diverse interpretations or challenges to church authority were potentially destabilizing to both religious and political hierarchies. But the most controversial explanation for these exclusions emerges from the Ethiopian texts themselves. Several passages in the Contentions of Christ describe Jesus teaching principles of spiritual equality that directly challenged patriarchal structures. In one account, 17-year-old Jesus tells his mother Mary, "The divine wisdom flows through women as it does through men, and the day will come when this truth is recognized again." Multiple passages describe Jesus privately instructing Mary Magdalene in spiritual mysteries that he didn't share with his male disciples, explaining, "She sees what they cannot yet see, for her heart is unclouded by desire for power." These teachings on gender equality would have directly threatened the emerging male-dominated church hierarchy of the 4th and 5th centuries. This may be the real reason these texts were suppressed, argues Dr. Catherine Schaefer, specialist in gender and religion at Harvard Divinity School. They presented a Jesus who explicitly challenged the very power structures that the institutional church was building. A Jesus who taught spiritual equality was dangerous to a church increasingly organized around male authority. The Ethiopian church, geographically isolated from Roman political pressures, preserved these more egalitarian traditions. This helps explain why Ethiopian Christianity historically granted women greater spiritual roles than Western branches of the faith, including female monastics with teaching authority and women serving as church treasurers and administrators. The process of biblical canonization wasn't a single conspiracy, but developed gradually over centuries. Different regional churches maintained different collections of texts until standardization slowly occurred. Ethiopia's geographical isolation from these political pressures allowed it to maintain a more diverse collection, preserving voices and traditions that were systematically eliminated elsewhere. When King James I of England commissioned his famous Bible translation in 1604, completed in 1611, he further solidified which texts most English-speaking Christians would consider canonical. The 47 scholars who worked on this translation operated under specific instructions from the king, including guidelines that reinforced church hierarchy and royal authority. The King James translators were brilliant scholars, notes biblical historian Dr. James Hamilton, but they were also products of their time and place. Working with texts that had already been filtered through centuries of selection, they never saw the Ethiopian manuscripts, which might have profoundly changed their understanding of Jesus' development. This historical reality forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. Is our understanding of Jesus incomplete because powerful interests throughout history didn't want us to see his full humanity? The Ethiopian texts suggest we've been missing crucial chapters of the story. The very years when Jesus grew from a precocious child into the revolutionary teacher who would change history. Ancient wisdom reimagined the meaning and legacy of Ethiopia's Jesus. Modern scientific discoveries have begun to shed new light on Ethiopia's ancient Christian traditions, forcing scholars to reconsider texts long dismissed as apocryphal. The 2012 genetic research from the University of Cambridge confirmed significant genetic mixing between Ethiopian and Middle Eastern populations, precisely during Solomon's era. Compelling evidence that has scholars revisiting Ethiopia's historical claims with newfound respect. Archaeological discoveries also continue to strengthen Ethiopia's position as one of Christianity's earliest strongholds. In 2018, researchers uncovered what appears to be a 4th-century church at Aksum, one of the oldest Christian structures in sub-Saharan Africa and contemporary with the earliest churches in Rome. Carbon dating of religious artifacts from this site aligns perfectly with Ethiopia's claims of early Christian presence, long before European missionaries arrived on the continent. The manuscripts themselves have yielded surprising insights under modern analysis. Multispectral imaging technology, which can detect ink invisible to the naked eye, has revealed hidden text beneath some passages, earlier versions that were modified over time. These palimpsests provide unique windows into how the texts evolved, showing that the Ethiopian tradition was not static, but engaged in its own process of theological reflection and development. What's emerging, explains Dr. Michael Heiser, biblical scholar and ancient languages expert, is evidence of an authentic, independent Christian tradition with legitimate claims to antiquity. These aren't later medieval inventions, but texts with clear connections to Christianity's earliest centuries. But beyond historical validation, the Ethiopian texts offer something potentially more valuable, a more complete understanding of Jesus as both divine and human. The developmental narrative they present, Jesus growing, learning, and sometimes struggling with his extraordinary nature, provides a bridge between the human and divine that the more polished canonical Gospels often obscure. These texts don't diminish Jesus' divinity, they illuminate his humanity, argues theologian Dr. Richard Rohr. They show us someone who had to integrate his divine nature through authentic human experience, exactly the spiritual journey each of us faces, albeit on a different scale. This perspective offers profound implications for contemporary spiritual seekers. A Jesus who learned to control his temper, who studied with teachers from different traditions, who gradually came to understand his purpose. This figure provides a more accessible model for human spiritual development than the fully formed miracle worker who emerges without context in the canonical Gospels at age 30. For many modern Christians struggling to reconcile faith with reason, these Ethiopian texts offer a middle path. They present a Jesus who embodies both the mystery of divinity and the reality of human growth, a Messiah who didn't bypass the essential human experience of development, but embraced it fully. However, the most startling revelation emerged during my final days in Ethiopia, when an aging monk named Abba Johannes approached me after learning of my research. Speaking in hushed tones, he revealed something that sounds more like a Dan Brown novel than academic research. "What you've seen is only the outer teaching," he whispered, glancing nervously at younger monks nearby. "Beneath the monastery of Debre Damo exists a sealed chamber, accessed through a hidden passage behind the altar. Inside are texts considered too profound for general revelation, Jesus' esoteric teachings about consciousness, cosmology, and humanity's divine potential." According to Abba Johannes, these texts, which he claimed to have glimpsed as a young monk before the chamber was resealed in the 1970s, contain Jesus' advanced spiritual instructions, including meditation practices and metaphysical principles that align remarkably with modern quantum physics and consciousness research. Is this hidden chamber real or legendary? Ethiopian authorities deny its existence, and no independent researcher has verified the claim. Yet similar stories emerge from multiple monastery sites, suggesting either a widespread tradition or a remarkable coincidence. Whether or not these deeper teachings exist, what remains undeniable is that the Ethiopian tradition preserves a more multidimensional Jesus than the one presented in Western Christianity, a Jesus whose missing years reveal a complex journey of growth, struggle, and integration that mirrors our own human experience. As we conclude this exploration of Ethiopia's forgotten Jesus, I invite you to reflect on what other wisdom might lie preserved in traditions we've overlooked or forgotten. What other voices might enrich our understanding of history, spirituality, and human experience if we're willing to listen? The persistence of Ethiopia's ancient Christian tradition against incredible odds, surviving invasions, fires, political upheavals, and modernization pressures, speaks to the resilience of wisdom that refuses to be silenced. While powerful empires and institutions have risen and fallen, this ancient African Christian tradition has quietly maintained its heritage, waiting for a time when the wider world would be ready to appreciate its value. Perhaps that time has finally come. In our quest for certainty as we navigate life's second half, we often forget that growth never truly ends. The Ethiopian Jesus story, whether historical fact or profound metaphor, offers a powerful reminder that even the most revered figures experience the messy, unfinished nature of becoming. Like Jesus in these ancient texts, our own lives contain missing years, periods of struggling, learning, and transformation that may not feature in the polished narratives we present to the world, yet profoundly shaped who we've become. As we age, we face a choice: to cling to rigid certainties or to embrace the continuing evolution of our understanding. The Ethiopian manuscripts remind us that wisdom often resides in overlooked places, in traditions different from our own, in voices that powerful institutions have marginalized, in perspectives that challenge our comfortable assumptions. They invite us to ask, what voices have we failed to hear in our own lives? What wisdom have we dismissed because it didn't align with our established worldview? Perhaps the most profound lesson these ancient texts offer isn't about theology at all, but about human development. They suggest that integration, reconciling our contradictory aspects, balancing our power with responsibility, embracing both our divine potential and human limitations, represents life's essential journey. This work doesn't end at 30, 50, or even 80. Like the young Jesus stretching the wooden beam, we too are constantly growing, extending beyond our perceived limitations, discovering new capacities while honoring our roots. In this unfinished, ongoing story lies not disappointment but profound hope that our own missing years still contain possibilities for transformation we have yet to imagine. If you found this journey through Ethiopia's ancient Christian tradition enlightening, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What aspects of this forgotten Jesus story resonated most with you? Have you encountered other overlooked wisdom traditions that challenged your understanding? Your perspective enriches our collective exploration. Don't miss our upcoming investigations into other hidden histories and forgotten wisdom traditions. Subscribe to our channel to be notified when new videos are released, including our upcoming series on lost spiritual practices from around the world. If you believe these stories deserve wider recognition, please share this video with friends and family who might appreciate a more complex understanding of religious history. And if you value this type of in-depth exploration, please support our work by liking this video and subscribing. Together, we can continue uncovering the profound wisdom that history has preserved against incredible odds.